So the first topic is light. You do need to be somewhat familiar with the visible light spectrum. So if you remember as a kid, the Roy G. Biv to help you remember the rainbow, that is going to be useful for you as well in AP Psychology, because that talks about the visible light spectrum, the light that we can actually, what we can actually see, the waves. And so the wavelengths that are longer tend to be towards the left. So that would be like the red colors, the red hue. And then the shorter wavelengths tend to go towards the blue and the violet. And you should know that every once in a while that does pop up as like a test question, like which of these has the longest wavelengths? And then you're in your head, you just have to go Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and then put them, you know, red longest, violet shortest. So the other stuff that's on here, like radio waves, TV waves, I don't think that's important. You don't really need to know that, but just make sure you know your rainbow, basically, and then what that actually means in regards to the wavelength that is happening. And then we're going to continue to talk about wavelength a little bit here. So how do we actually experience then color, and based on the wavelength that is hitting us in our eyes? And so the wavelength is important because it determines the hue of what we are looking at. And so the longer the wavelength, the redder the color towards that end of the spectrum. And so I think we know this in like science class. I'm assuming we go over this, but we measure from like peak to peak or trough to trough. So if you look at the bottom left in that visual, that is a longer wavelength from peak to peak there. And so that is going to lead us to say, yep, that's red. And then the upper left one, shorter wavelength, that's scrunched together, right, peak to peak there, that is going to tell us the color. So basically wavelength determines hue or color of what we're seeing. The amplitude then, how high or how low we're going, determines how bright it is. So if we want a really, really bright, deep red, then we're going to have really deep troughs and peaks. And if we have just kind of a bland, kind of blasé color, then we're going to have shorter amplitude. This is a pretty frequent question that's asked on the test, something about amplitude or something about wavelength. So just make sure you memorize that the visible light spectrum, wavelength tells me where that color is going to fall on the visible light spectrum. And then the amplitude is how deep or bright the color is going to be. So then we actually need to know the parts of the eye, right? So we can't do much with just determining wavelength and color if we didn't have all of these parts of the eye. And I typically quiz my kids on this because I think it's important, particularly because you don't know what specific parts you might get asked about on the AP test. So you need to know the pupil, which is just the adjustable opening in the center of your eye. Everything's labeled on here. That's a candle. That's on the left side of the screen. So that's like the image that's being projected into your eye. So the pupil is the adjustable opening in the center of the eye, and that's where the light comes in. The lens then is the structure behind the pupil, and that's going to help focus the image, almost like kind of like a magnifying glass, maybe not a magnifying glass, but it helps to focus the image that's coming in. The iris, not super important in AP Psych, but it's just the muscle that forms the colored part of your eye, so your green eyes or blue eyes or brown eyes, whatever color you have. The cornea then is where the light enters the eye. So those parts I don't think are super important for you necessarily to remember. They'll once in a while like ask you to like, a question might say like, identify the correct order in which light enters the eye, and then it'll be like cornea, pupil, lens, lens, pupil, cornea, retina, and it'll list all the parts of the eye in like various orders. So you do sort of have to know how that actually works, like that the light goes in through the pupil and then or in through the cornea, and then it hits the retina and that sort of thing. But I don't think they're going to ask you anything specific about the lens or the pupil or the iris or the cornea, just kind of being able to identify what they are and just the most basic kind of role that they play. However, when we get into the retina, that's more important, and that's maybe where they're going to ask you more questions about. I think that's probably the most commonly asked about part of the eye. And so the retina is really the light-sensitive part of our eye, and that's where all of our receptors are, where our rods and our cones are. And we're going to talk about them on the next slide, but those are important to our vision and to us being able to see various things. Then the fovea is just that central focus point on the back of your eye, and that's where the retina kind of clusters its cones. So the retina is that whole sort of back part there. The fovea is that focus point on there. And then the optic nerve is that thing sticking out of the back, and that's what carries the message that goes from your eye up to your brain. It's a big nerve, basically. It's a bunch of axons all wound together, and it sends those impulses to your brain to be interpreted into a picture. And then there's also the blind spot. And just the one thing you need to know about the blind spot is it's blind. You can't see anything in that one spot because it's where those nerve endings start for the optic nerve. And so there's no retina cells there. It's just the optic nerve. So that's kind of the gist of the parts of the eye. Again, being able to just kind of understand how light passes through and focuses is probably the most important part until you actually get into specifically the retina, which we're going to talk a little bit more about right now because that to me is the most important part of the eye. So the retina is made up of two main things that you need to know, rods and cones. Rods are what give us more of our like nighttime vision. They're sensitive in dim light. So when it's dark out, they're going to be able to like pick up more information and tell us things. But if you've ever tried to see in the dark, they're also not super great at creating like details and things like that. So you can kind of see in the dark, but it's not like super fine vision or anything like that. And so if we were to look at like nocturnal animals, what's a nocturnal animal? Are raccoons? I think a raccoon is nocturnal. I'm going to go with that. They have almost all rods because animals who are active at night need better night vision, so they have more of them. We, on the other hand, have a lot of cones. And so cones are going to center around the fovea. And so if we look back on this slide, the fovea is where that information, that candle there is focused on the back of our eye. And so, oops, wrong tab. And so we have a lot of cones there because that's what's going to give us our detail and our information that gets sent to our brain. And so cones help us perceive color. And how I remember that is cone starts with C, color starts with C, cones and color. And they center around the fovea because that's our focus point, and that's what gives us fine detail, gives us precision, lets us see all of the little specifics of what we're looking at. And some even have like a hotline to the brain for really specific things like texture and stuff like that. So cones are what really give us our like acute good vision, and rods kind of give us a little bit more of the dark, just kind of like survival type vision, I guess you could call it. And so what happens is the rods and cones work together and they create this picture, or they're triggered, I should say, by the light. And then that light activates some bipolar cells, which activate the ganglion cells, which is the optic nerve, and then the message goes to the brain. So depending like how it's triggered and what it's triggered, certain rods and cones turn on and off, and then that message is sent to the brain where it's interpreted. We could do a demo too to look at rods and cones. So if you look at the picture up there, the left side that's showing you where the rods are more on the peripheral of your vision. And so I do a demo, and you can try this with your friends. It sometimes works, sometimes not. They have to be like looking straight forward. So if you do this with a friend, take a colored marker, like any color, but don't show them what it is. And you can start by, I don't know if you can see it. Here we go. You can start by like putting the color behind their head and tell them to just focus straight ahead. And you can slowly bring the marker around until it's in their peripheral vision, but they have to keep looking ahead. And when they first see the marker, they're only going to just see a marker, and you'll ask them what color it is, and they'll most likely say like black or gray because it's only being picked up by the rods, because the rods are on the outside of our eyes. And then not until you bring it more like here, the cones actually pick it up. Sorry, here, more towards the front. The cones pick it up and can actually interpret the color. So that can kind of show you the rods are kind of back here off to the side. The cones pick up stuff more towards the front with color. So our peripheral, right, is not very detailed and not very fine, but looking straight ahead, it is. So the rods are here, the cones are more here, if that makes sense. Ooh, that is a good question. Someone's asking in the Ask a Question tab, would a person with poor vision have less or damaged cones? I don't think that vision, it has to do with when you wear like contacts and stuff. I believe it has more to do with how it's being focused onto your fovea, and that's why like contacts and glasses help focus the image. Cones are going to be more having to do with like if you're colorblind or if you're missing like part of your color vision, whereas I believe like contact lenses and glasses and stuff actually help to focus the image into your eye better, because that's what your eye is like struggling with. Not 100% sure on all the specifics on how like contacts and things do that, but that is like to the best of my knowledge how that is going to work. Good question. All right, so that's rods and cones. And like I said, we spent a little more time on that because to me, that is typically the more important part of the eye that they're going to quiz you on. You should still know all the parts, but that's like the commonly asked part. Another demo that we could do right now is to just see how sensitive our retinas is. So we can all do this while we're sitting here. If you look to the left and then close your eyes, so your eyes are looking kind of down and to the left, and then you gently rub the right side of your eyelid. So I'm looking this way and I'm rubbing this side of my eye. What do you see is happening? I see some light over here, like a little ball of light every time I like wiggle my eye around. And so basically what that's showing us is I'm actually activating my retinal cells. They're super duper sensitive to like light and even pressure. Pressure makes it, kind of tricks it into thinking like, oh, I'm seeing something, but I'm not. And so it interprets the light as coming from the left. That's why I see it over here. Because light from the left triggers the receptor cells on the right. Remember, things cross over in our brain and in our eye. And so it's actually kind of like tricking your brain into thinking you're seeing light. So you can do that, and it works on both sides. I see the light over here now when I'm doing it this way. So just another little demo you can do on your own to kind of demonstrate retinal disparity and information. So now we're going to kind of move on to the brain and how the brain plays a role in vision. So then once the message like leaves my eye, the optic nerve has a hotline into my brain, and we have really specific like nerve cells in our brain that respond to all different things. We have specific nerve cells for shapes and angles and movements and textures and things like that. And so as those nerve cells are activated by that message from our optic nerve, we put together basically a picture, and that's what we see. And so these feature detector cells, they detect features, shapes, angles, movements, things like that. They're in our visual cortex, and they pass that info then on to other brain areas where different teams of cells work together to create a complex pattern. And what's actually like really interesting is if I were to put you in a functional MRI machine, remember a functional MRI shows me both the activity and the structure of your brain. And I could put pictures in front of you like a house, a face, a chair. Different parts of your brain are actually going to respond to those different things. And I could sort of tell like even what you're looking at just based on what parts of your brain are lighting up. So that's really cool. We have like really specific cells that respond to really specific things. And we can actually see that through technology that we have. Oh, you must be looking at a house, or you must be looking at a face because this part of your brain lit up and is active in response to what I'm showing you. And so particularly, we have one team of like really specific supercells that recognizes faces. And so it's going to be like right here behind your right ear. That's where it exists. And so if you think about it as a human, recognizing faces is like pretty super duper important. And so we do have like a very specific part of our brain that takes care of that for us. And so it takes all of the pieces of a human face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, freckles, eyebrows, whatever, puts them together into a recognizable face. And what's interesting is if you had damage to this part of your brain, or if there was some sort of malfunction, you can have what we call face blindness. Face blindness is kind of the less technical term. It's called prosopagnosia. That's the more scientific way of saying it. But basically, people who suffer from prosopagnosia have either, they're not like missing this part of the brain, but it doesn't work properly, basically. They never recognize faces. So your mom, you've grown up with your mom your whole life, you know who she is, obviously. You would think that it would be hard to not like recognize her face. But someone with prosopagnosia could be walking down the street past their mom and they wouldn't even recognize her. It would just be another random face on the street. If they looked in the mirror, they wouldn't recognize their own face. Even though it's the same face they've seen every single day for their whole lives, they wouldn't be able to recognize it. And it's because that part of their brain that's supposed to put all of those pieces of the face together doesn't like mesh them all together correctly. Like they see your eyes, they see your nose, they see your mouth, but that like whole picture kind of being put together doesn't work for them, basically. And so this picture that's on this slide was actually someone who has face blindness put this picture together and said, this is kind of how I see people. It's like I kind of see their features, their eyes, their nose, their mouth, but it doesn't all come together and make like a whole face for me. It's still like possible sometimes for people with prosopagnosia to recognize faces, because what they do is they memorize like specific features. Like, for example, I have a slight mole right here on my face. And so if I was friends with someone with face blindness, they might try and remember my face by, okay, she has a mole right here. And so then if I were to start talking to them, they can look at the individual pieces that make up my face, my mouth, my mole, my nose piercing, my eyes. And it doesn't make a whole picture, but they can kind of remember, oh yeah, she had this, this, and this. This must be Megan. And then they can kind of work that way. But it takes longer for them to process, and they won't ever like remember my face as a whole. So it's kind of a unique circumstance, but it also just kind of shows how that all works in the brain. And when there's a malfunction, then we get face blindness. And so our brain, when it's processing any sort of image, goes through what we call parallel processing. And so it divides a scene or a picture or an image into many different dimensions, because I think we just look at something and it happens so fast that we see it, right? We just see this image and that's what it is. But in reality, we're looking at maybe motion and the form and the depth and the color, and all of those pieces have to come together to form a picture for us, or we don't see something. And so I think it's actually really cool when you think about how your brain takes all of those different pieces of what's happening in a split second and tells you what you're looking at and shows you that picture. And so it's called parallel processing, because we've got all of these different aspects, motion, form, depth, color, and they're all being worked on kind of at the same time to lead us to whatever we're looking at. Another example of this could be seen through Blindsight. I don't know if you guys have read about that or not, but Blindsight is when, like, for example, if I can shut down your visual cortex with some electrodes and things like that. So basically your brain says, I don't see anything because the visual cortex is shut down. It's not working. However, if I asked you a question about a picture that I put in front of you, and if it had horizontal or vertical lines, about 75% of the time you'd be able to correctly tell me the answer. And about 80% of the time you'd be able to tell me the color correctly of the lines or the picture that I'm showing you. Even though if I said, what do you see? You're like, I see nothing. I don't see anything. Well, what color is it? And you'd be like, red. So how does that work? It's because we have these multiple layers of processing that's happening. So even if our visual cortex is kind of like broken or not functioning properly, we still may be getting some of that information in one way or another. Now, this doesn't count for people who are like legitimately like blind, but in some cases, like Blindsight is like a rare example of how this processing still allows some sort of kind of vision to seep in, even though you don't see anything. Your brain is still kind of processing the information. So kind of to summarize then, how visual processing works. Let's say we're looking at this tiger. And so what process does my eye and my brain go through to see it? So first, it's the retinal stuff. It's the rods and the cones. They're in my brain and they're taking in that info. They trigger the bipolar cells, which trigger the ganglion cells, and then the message goes to my brain. So that's the eye part. Then in my brain, I have feature detector cells that's responding to edges, lines, and angles. And then the parallel processing happens where I start to combine all of that information, the motion, the form, the depth, and the color. And then the final product is I see a tiger. And so we can look at it in these steps, which makes it seem slow and kind of clunky, but we know that our brain recognizes things basically instantaneously. But if we could really slow the process down and kind of flesh it out, this is how it would sort of work. These are like the 4 main steps that go through, that our eye and our brain go through to help us perceive something. Okay, so just kind of make sure you know some of those basic things, and you should be good to go for visual processing. We're going to next talk about how we see color, because that's a very specific process that also happens. So we're going to kind of go back to a little bit about talking about cones, because cones are what enable our color vision. And so there's 2 main theories, and you need to know these. These are important about how we see color and why we see color as humans. And so the Young-Helmholtz Trichromatic Theory, Tri-3, that should help you, says that we have 3 types of color receptors. We have red receptors, green receptors, and blue receptors. And basically, as light hits the cones in my eye, certain receptors are turned on, certain receptors are turned off, and that combination of on and off tells me that I'm seeing orange or pink or purple or gray or whatever color that I'm seeing. So basically, the light triggers a response in the cones, and then out of those 3 types of receptors, some are turned on and some are turned off. And that's how we see color. It's almost like, like when you're in elementary school and you combine like paint colors to make different colors. That's sort of what's happening in your eye. There's a combination of cones that are being turned on and off, and that combination lets me see color. So people who are colorblind are missing one or more of those receptors. So people who are missing just one type of receptor would be called dichromatic. And so commonly, I believe that's the green one that most people are missing. It's green or red. I can't remember right now off the top of my head. But if you're missing that color receptor, then you can still see other colors. Your shades are just a little bit off, and they're a little bit different than what other people say because you still have a combination turning on and off. You're just missing a chunk of it. So you just don't see the full spectrum of colors like other people do. And then you could be missing 2 sets of receptors, and you could be monochromatic, and then your vision's much more kind of grays, and it's not nearly as like bright colors and things like that. So that's kind of how color blindness works. You're missing 1 or 2 sets of the receptors. And you can take those, like there's like online tests, like, are you colorblind? And it's like a video with like numbers embedded around colors, and it would show you pretty quickly like how acute or astute your vision is. One year I actually had a student figure out that they were slightly colorblind. By doing that test, they hadn't known it their whole life. So obviously it didn't impact them greatly, but it was also kind of like, oh gosh, I didn't realize that I hadn't been seeing like a full spectrum of colors my whole life. So it's kind of interesting, I guess. All right, so that's the first theory. We have 3 receptor types. They go on and off and let us see color. The second theory is called the opponent process theory. This one's a little bit trickier. So this one, we have 3 sets of receptors. We have red-green that go together, white-black that go together, and blue-yellow. And that's the only combination, red-green, white-black, blue-yellow. And so when we see a certain color, when we look at a certain image, either the red turns on or the green turns on. They are opponents of each other. So only one can turn on and one can turn off. The white can turn on or the black can turn on. The blue or the yellow. And then that combination is kind of what allows us to see colors. And so according to this theory, like if you think about it, have you ever seen a color called reddish green? It's just not a color that really exists in the world. And it's because it can't, because you either have the red turned on or the green turned on. You can't have both turned on, according to the opponent process theory. Or the same thing like a bluish yellow. Like that color doesn't exist because you either have the blue turned on or the yellow turned on based on what you're looking at. And so it says the cones, that's where the trichromatic part is, send the message to the ganglion cells, remember that's in the optic nerve, which then excite or inhibit the color combination seen above. So these two theories don't work against each other, they actually work together. The trichromatic theory happens first in the cones, and then that message that's sent by the trichromatic theory goes to the ganglion cells, which then do this red-green switch, white-black switch, or blue-yellow switch. And so if you've ever heard of complementary afterimages, that's where this comes from. So I'm going to show you an example on the next page. So depending on your screen quality, this may or may not work. I'm going to give you like 30 seconds. I want you to stare at that blue dot in the center of the flag. And then when I tell you to, you're going to look at the other blue dot in the white space. So like 30 seconds. Here we go. Stare at that blue dot in the flag. Just keep staring, keep staring, keep staring. Okay, look at the other blue dot. You should see, in theory, the correctly colored American flag. The yellow should turn to blue, the black should turn to white, and the green should turn to red. So what's happening here, according to the opponent process theory, is that when you stared at that green, yellow, and black flag, green, yellow, black, yes, the green, yellow, and black flag, you were really working those receptors, the green, the black, and the yellow receptors were working really hard in your eyes. And so then when you look away, and then you see that complementary after image, basically the green, the black, and the yellow were tired from you staring at that image for so long that we flip, and all the switches flipped, and then you saw the red, white, and blue. So this works with complementary after images. The flag is the best example because it actually looks like the American flag when we do that. So that is explained by the opponent process theory. Here we go. So seeing color, there's multiple phases here. And you have to understand how this works together. First, though, I want to kind of throw something trippy at you. First of all, objects don't have color. Nothing that I look at has any color to it. Color is sort of an illusion. Basically, colors or objects reflect light waves. And as those light waves reflect off of an object, my brain interprets those light waves as having color. So it's more of a mental construct. Our brain sees the color, but the color, the object really doesn't have that color. It's reflecting that light wave back to my eye. And so I kind of think about it like this. If I'm looking at a red object, like my Wisconsin Badger t-shirt that I wear, I'm a big Badger fan. They lost this weekend to Illinois, which was horrible. But anyways, I'm looking at my bright red Wisconsin Badger sweater. And so my brain has been taught, or I've been taught since childhood, that the light waves that bounce off of that mean red. That wavelength is red, and so my brain tells me that it's red. The shirt itself technically isn't red. Things don't have color. It's just how the light waves reflect off of it. So that color processing then that happens in my brain goes through two phases. First, we have the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory. So the retina's cones are responding. That's the top part of that image there with the S, the M, and the L, the blue, the green, and the red. So my cones are responding based on what's happening. And then the opponent process theory takes over. Depending on which cells were triggered, it flips the black switch or the white switch, the red switch or the green switch, and the blue switch or the yellow switch, which then sends that message to my brain, processing that picture, that image. So seems really complicated for something that I think we pretty much take for granted on an almost daily basis, but that is how color vision works, to the best of our knowledge. So now we're going to move on to talking a little bit about how we perceive things and how our perception of what we're looking at can be influenced by our brain and by our tendencies and by our prior experiences. So all of us have them, perceptual sets, which are basically just like biases or assumptions that we have, and then they impact what we see. So it's this idea of like top-down processing where I see something and my expectation and my prior experience influences what I see. So if you were to look at this image, if you saw the picture on the right first, you probably see an old woman. And then if you look at the picture on the left, you probably saw a young woman, like her profile this way, right? And then if you look at the middle picture, what you see is often impacted by what picture you looked at first. If you looked at the left side, which was more of the young woman picture, then in that middle picture, you probably still see the young woman. If you looked at the picture on the right first and saw the old woman first, then your perception of that middle picture is probably of an old woman. So basically what's happening is your prior experience of either seeing the young woman or the old woman is influencing what you see on that middle picture, whether you see young or old. And it's not right or wrong, it's just how you are interpreting that. I have a very hard time seeing the young woman in that middle picture just because I always see the old woman first. And so in my brain, it's kind of ingrained. But if I look really hard and try and piece it together, I can see the profile of the young woman. But basically what's happening is my brain here is impacting how I'm perceiving a situation. And that can happen all of the time, in our daily lives. This is just one example of that. And so basically this perceptual set says that these expectations influence our perception. Do you see a rabbit or a duck in that picture? If I had been previously talking about my pet bunny, Hopper, let's say that's his name. I don't have a pet rabbit, but if I had been talking about my pet bunny Hopper and how cute he is and how he likes to eat carrots and all of that, and then I flip to this slide, you might already be thinking about a rabbit because I've been talking about it. Therefore, you're more likely to see the rabbit in that picture. However, if I had been talking about the duck or Aflac and the duck mascot and things like that, when I flipped to this slide, maybe you would see a duck when you first look at it. So your expectation, I kind of primed you to think about something, influenced how you see that picture. Again, there's no right or wrong in how you're looking at it. We just have to understand that our visual perception isn't always straightforward and accurate. I could look at something and you could look at something and we could have completely different interpretations of it based on our previous experiences and our perceptual sets. So we just have to have that kind of understanding of the world around us. I see the question in the question tab. I'm going to get into that in a second. I apologize. So schemas then form our perceptual set, and so that's just like how we build up the information in our heads. But think, for example, like of a schema that I always think of is if we think about gender. And so when people often like play with like a baby boy, like what do they say? Oh, you're a big, strong boy. Look at my big, strong man, blah, blah, blah. And you kind of say those characteristics. So that's kind of a perceptual set or an influence of what a boy should act like, look like, be like, whatever. And when you play with a baby girl, it's like, oh, you're so sweet and you're adorable and you're a princess and all of those sorts of things. Your perceptual set, your perception of what a good girl does is influenced by that, and that's how you treat them. So it's the same sort of thing in our vision. Our perception of something, our pre-existing notions can influence what we see and feel. So for context effect, this is an example. So these are examples of kind of perceptual sets, kind of ways that we are influenced in our thinking. We can also undo it, basically. Because if I showed you this picture and you didn't know who Shaq was and you didn't know who The Rock was, and I'm blanking on who is that guy? He's another basketball player, the guy on the left. If you know his name, put it in the chat. Charles Barkley. It's Charles Barkley. If you didn't know who these guys were, you'd think that guy in the middle looks kind of little, right? Doesn't he look kind of shrimpy next to Shaq and Charles Barkley? But because of the context, because I know, oh, Shaq's huge and Charles Barkley is huge and The Rock's a pretty big dude too, I can work backwards in my brain and understand that that's not a little dude in the middle. That's like a really big dude. He's just next to even like bigger guys in the picture. And so our brain works backwards to allow a later stimulus to determine how we perceive an earlier one. So it allows us to kind of work back, consider the context of the situation, and figure out what we are looking at. If that makes sense. Before we get into Gestalt, I'm going to look at this question, and I'm afraid I don't know if I have a good answer for you. The question is, how does color theory work? Like how red evokes anger and passion. I, unfortunately, do not have a good answer for you for that. That's not something that I've ever studied or talked about, so I don't want to give you wrong information. What I can do is look into it a little bit more, and I can post a little snippet about it in the resources here. So if you come back later and check the resources, which everyone should do, this is always available to you. But come back and check. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for color theory. Yeah. All right. So Gestalt principles then involve our vision. And there's a few different things. Gestalt basically means like how our brain groups things together. So when I look at a picture, how does it group certain things together? How do I interpret it? And one Gestalt principle is just this idea of figure ground. And if any of you have taken art, you probably know a lot of these basic principles. But figure ground is just like, what's the focal point? What am I seeing when I look at an image? That's the figure. And then what's everything else, like the background stuff. So in the picture on the right, it's this like woman doing this like yoga pose thing. Like she is the central focus point. Your attention is drawn to that. And then the background is everything else in that picture. She is the figure. Everything else is the background. When we have things like the picture on the left, it gets a little bit more interesting. Typically, I believe if you looked at the picture on the left, you would see the faces first. That would be what most people would see, the black faces, because that's what like the picture is, right? The white stuff is just empty space. It makes the shape of a vase when you look at it, but usually our vision is drawn to like the actual thing, in this case, the black outlines of the faces. So in this one, the figure typically we would say is the faces, and then the background is the vase that we see. But we can play all kinds of tricks with our mind by putting like pictures together like that. Another Gestalt principle is this idea of proximity. So we group things together that are like near each other. So for example, the dots, the right side of the page with the dots, like the two columns and the two columns, we would say that those two columns are together and those two columns are together. Just based on proximity, our brain says that's a group and that's a group because they're aligned together and they're aligned together. And so that's how the Gestalt principle, basically it's just like shortcuts and things that our brain does to like organize information and group it together to help our brain interpret things. The picture on the bottom left, to me, the 5 people on the right seem to be more together. They're all kind of standing close together. And then there's a gap, and then there's the 2 other people. So to me, it's kind of like a 5-person group and a 2-person group. When I look at it, that's how my brain kind of organizes the info. Or another example here on the right is how the boats are docked. Those like skinny piers seem to me to be one group, and then another pier is another group, etc., etc. So your brain just kind of makes these mental shortcuts and groups to help us just basically make quick decisions and understand things. The principle of closure is another Gestalt principle that allows us to like kind of study and make information. So when you see the very first image on the left, do you see a white triangle with like 3 half kind of circle things on the end? There is no triangle there, but your brain fills it in and closes those things off and says that there is a triangle there just by how you look at it. Same thing with the panda. The panda is just a bunch of white space. It's not completely filled in or closed off, but your brain kind of fills in those gaps and says, yep, that's a panda. Or the soccer ball on the upper right. It's not really a soccer ball. It's a bunch of black shapes, kind of pentagon-like shapes, but your brain puts that together and says that's a soccer ball. It closes the gaps, it closes that information and finishes it for you. So that's just the principle of closure. Our brain fills things in for us. Again, another shortcut. It helps us understand things. And then continuity is the final Gestalt principle that we're going to talk about. We understand that things keep going even if we can't see them. So for example, this highway here with the clover things, the on-ramp and the off-ramp, we know that even though we lose sight in the middle there of that bottom part of the highway, our brain says, yep, that continues onward. It's not It's not like the road ends and then it starts again. Our brain fills in that gap and says that there's a continuation. Same thing with the keys on the left. It's not like that the key that's pointing kind of this way. It's not like there's a piece missing in it, right? Our brain just understands that it's in the back and that it continues onward. So Gestalt principles are one way that our like brain and vision kind of work together to interpret things. We also have depth perception cues, which help us with our vision and understanding the world around us and seeing things. There's two types. We have binocular cues, and if you know, like bi means two. So a binocular cue is one that we use both eyes for. Binocular, we need both eyes. Particularly, binocular cues are useful in judging distance, so helping us like with depth perception and things like that. And the main binocular cue is called retinal disparity. You can hold your thumb out like this. I can't get my thumb on the screen. There we go. And if you, the further that you like cover something up, like if you can look at something across the room, cover it up with your thumb with both eyes open, and then switch which eye is open and shut. And it'll look like your thumb is judging back and jumping back and forth. That's retinal disparity, because what each eye sees individually is slightly different, because I have one eye on this side of my head and one eye on this side of my head. And so what they're seeing is not identical. But how retinal disparity works is my brain takes the thing seen here, the thing seen here, and it pieces it together into an image. But when you only have one eye versus the other, you're seeing slightly different things. And then monocular cues, we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. I just got a few examples and then we're going to be done. Monocular cues are more important in judging further distance. So retinal disparity is important, especially for closer objects and like how close something is to my face. Monocular cues are going to be like looking down the highway, like that sort of distance, like far away things. And monocular, mono one, is a depth cue that's available to either eye by itself. I don't need both of my eyes for it. And I listed some examples there, but we're going to go through them. So the first monocular cue that we have is called interposition. And basically, when we look at something like the circle and the rectangle here, one thing is in front of the other. Therefore, we judge that that circle is closer, right? Because of how that looks, the circle appears closer to us. And I can cover up one eye. That works. I can cover up my other eye. I still see that. Or like the 8 ball here appears to be closer to us because it's in front of these other balls that are listed or that are shown in this picture. So that's interposition. When one thing is in front of another thing, it appears to be closer to us. The second monocular cue is linear perspective. So that's like the classic like picture here, like going down the highway, how it looks like the lines converge. That shows me, my brain interprets that as distance. As the closer the lines get together, the further away something is. However, if you look at the picture on the right, do those blue bars look like the same length? Probably not. You look at them and you're like, yeah, they're not the same length. The front one is shorter. But if you actually measure it, like take a piece of paper or take your finger and kind of measure how big it is, you'll see that those blue bars are actually identical. And so that's linear perspective playing a trick on your mind, because what's happening is the railroad tracks are actually slightly converging to make it give you this like idea of like distance and convergence and things like that. And again, one eye, I can see that with both of my eyes separately. I don't need both eyes for that. Relative height is often used in art. So typically something that's higher up in our visual field, like the tree in the upper right or the person in the upper left, whatever is higher in our visual field is perceived to be further away. So that tree in the upper right seems to be further away based on the fact that it is up in our field of vision. Even though it's a flat surface, that perception of that height within the image tells me that it's further away. So these are all little like cues and shortcuts that your brain makes to interpret information. And then the last thing is relative size. Same sort of idea. The thing that is bigger in our visual field is interpreted as being closer. So that can of Diet Coke looks closer. The can of Diet Coke on the right looks closer than the one on the left because it's larger. That van on the left is larger in my retina. It casts a larger image onto my retina, so I perceive it to be closer than that car, the next car in line. So that is a big summary of all of the vision stuff that you need to know for this unit. Like I said, I think some of the most important stuff is understanding like how color vision works, the retina with the rods and the cones, and then some of these like basic principles. And I think a lot of them are like self-explanatory: relative size, relative height. The kind of title gives it away a little bit.